Okay, I think we'll get started. I think we will get started with our second part. So we begin in chapter 21 with David fleeing to the priests at Nob. Nob is an interesting name. Part of me wonders what that actually is in Hebrew or what's going on with it. It just seems a little bit, I don't know, a different kind of town name, different way of saying it. So David flees to the priests at Nob. And he, at this point, must be pretty desperate. Like, things have not gone well. He is running for his life from a mad king. But what are some signs in the text that help you realize that David is desperate? He's asking to eat the showbread. Exactly. And he's asking for food. He probably doesn't ask for the showbread first. You know, that would be undecorous. Like, it would be unlikely. You don't ask for the nicest food first. If you're desperate, usually you ask, like, you know, in the modern world, could I have a slice of bread, kind of thing. But he ends up asking about the showbread. And so that is only lawful for the priest to eat. And this is one of the conundrums. So why can David eat it? And there's a couple of possibilities I think that the book brings out. One of them is that David seems to reclaim this older idea of being a priest king. Later, when the ark comes into Jerusalem, he'll stop and offer sacrifices. He'll dance before the Lord. He'll wear priestly garments. So it could be a restoration of this idea of a royal priesthood that had happened in the book of Genesis and got kind of knocked out or brushed aside in the story of the Exodus because of the golden calf. It's after the golden calf episode that priesthood is restricted to Levites and then to the family of Aaron within the tribe of Levi. So that's one possibility. The other one could be that they are so desperate that it's like they either get some food or they die. And Judaism allows a wide ability when you're acting to save a life. That when you're acting to save life, lots of the other commandments and the rules of the Torah and what they consider to be the Old Testament, they don't apply. And there's a lot of modern day parallels with this. One of them was in the modern state of Israel. The Jews had to realize that they had to fight on Saturdays. They couldn't take a Sabbath in the army because the other side didn't care. You know, they would often stage their attacks. In some of the initial wars in the land of Israel in 1949, I think, and again in 1967, the Arabians, the peoples around them, attacked on a Sabbath. They attacked on a Friday night because they knew that the Jews would be more likely to be relaxed, or they were celebrating their Sabbath. They weren't manning their positions. And so the Israeli army had to adopt a position that when you're in the army, you have to maintain your readiness even on a Sabbath. So it's possible that David is fleeing for his life and he's so incredibly desperate that it's eat the showbread or die. And there's reasons why it could be both of them. Ahimelech, who is the priest of the place, notes, I mean, he's trying to be faithful. He talks about, have your men abstain from women. And it would mean that they're not ritually unclean, that there's not uncleanness there. And remember that unclean isn't a moral judgment in this kind of case. It's just a ritual judgment. Some ordinary actions make you unclean through no fault of your own, or through even doing good things. But it also, I think one of the other pieces that comes out of the story here is the group with David at this point couldn't be all that large, because there's only 5 loaves of showbread to give them. And 5 loaves of bread doesn't get you very far with grown men, especially grown men who are starving and hungry. So unless, is it possible that the Lord multiplied it and there's a larger group? I would say so. But if David had a relatively large group with him, I doubt that he would be so afraid of Saul. It seems like he must have a fairly small group, because at this point, even though David is a brilliant military commander, his choice is always to run, which means that he doesn't feel like he can take King Saul on a field of battle, that he has to run away from him. Doeg shows up, who's a herdsman of Saul and an Edomite. I think he's an Edomite. And he is noted. David suspects right away that he's a spy, that he's going to go back and report to the king that David was there. And sure enough, that's what happens. But that also means David knows it's not safe to stay. And so he needs a weapon. Now, this is also strange. If you're running for your life, you'd think that one of the first things you want to grab is a weapon or something to defend yourself. When he doesn't have one, when no one in his group has one, and he's asking for weapons, and he's asking for weapons from a priest, you can tell again that this isn't ordinary stress. This isn't just he's on, a joyride riding around the country in his chariot and having fun. That he is in great need. And the fact that they only have one weapon is probably kind of tragic. And it so happens to be the sword of Goliath that David had taken from Goliath before. Somehow it ends up with the priests at Nob. Again, that's kind of strange. But nonetheless, it got there. It means, I think, that David is kind of starting from nothing at this point. His story, we think of him as this great king. We think of him as leading the people of Israel and of having these gifts and writing psalms and doing all these good things. But he really spent years on the run. He really spent years sort of being forged in the fire, that he doesn't have an easy life, and it's not just a matter of easy things, that he has his struggles. And his struggles are to a degree that I think would be hard for us. I mean, I've never been in a situation for any length of time where I was actually afraid for my life. I hope that's the case for you. But, this kind of stress does things to people. It can warp your mind. It can make things more unstable. You see it with people in wartime places, like the stories that come out of the Ukraine, that some people actually just kind of mentally break down and they can't handle it and they have panic attacks. And, sometimes they have a friend around them to calm them down and just kind of say, okay, it's time to stand up. We're going to walk this way. We're going to do this thing. And you have to be just kind of one little task at a time. But this is kind of what it's like for David. This is a time of deprivation and loss. If you remember in the life of Jesus, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph also have to flee. And they flee kind of into the desert, but on their way to Egypt. And it's a little bit the same in the life of David. This was also in the history of Israel. Abraham has to go to Egypt because of a famine in the land, and Jacob has to go to Egypt because of a famine in the land. This has been a pattern that's repeated again and again in the history of Israel about being on the run, being in need like this. This isn't an easy lifestyle. He has no home to go to. There's no place that he can just return to lay his head. And I think that piece of it is important as well, because so many of us, on a cold winter night, the one place that you want to be most of all is home. And if you don't have a home, if there literally isn't one because you're afraid and you're running for your life, again, there's a kind of stress to this that I think we have to appreciate. So David ultimately flees to Gath, and Gath is the city of Goliath. Gath is one of the Philistine cities, and this is one of the tables asked why, and this is one of the things that I think speaks to his desperation in the story. If he flees to Gath and he flees to the Philistines, I would argue that it has to be because things are so bad in the cities of Israel that he doesn't feel like he's safe in any one of them. He feels like Saul is going to come and get him, or he's going to be betrayed by someone, and so he flees to his enemies. And this would be a pretty big thing. It'd be sort of like if Vladimir Putin showed up on your doorstep, and is asking for a place to stay. It almost has to be somewhat like that, because David has been killing the Philistines by the thousands and by the 10,000s and leading the army against them. He's been very, very successful. And so all of a sudden he shows up in town and, is probably trying to go kind of incognito, probably trying to hide. He just needs to regroup. He needs a place where he can stay and he would be safe from Saul. Saul doesn't particularly like fighting the Philistines, so David probably thinks that he's going to be safe there. But it's not too long after he arrives that the people are like, hey, wait a minute. Isn't that David guy? He's like that, little shrimpy army commander who keeps killing people. And so word gets back to the king. And now he's not even safe in Gath because the king knows about who he is. And he's likely to be assaulted, or he's likely to be molested there in some way. He's likely to be attacked. And so now he has to play mad. He has to feign madness. He has to fake it, like that he actually went crazy, in order for them not to take him seriously, in order to kind of minimize the threat that he poses. And they probably laughed at him. I mean, there's a lot of shame and embarrassment to doing something like this. They probably were not very kind. Like, oh, look at the mighty warrior, and now, he's drooling on himself and laying on the ground and moaning in pain. That kind of thing. They're probably not the nicest people. But David feigns madness. And again, it's a really interesting contrast between David and Saul. It sets up these oppositions because David plays mad, but he's not. Saul thinks that he's rational and he's behaving rightly, and he actually is crazy. So in David's case, feigning madness and minimizing his threat is a sign of wisdom. It's a sign of his intelligence, that he realizes without doing something like this, he's as good as dead. If he doesn't do something extreme, the Philistines are going to kill him. And if the Philistines don't kill him, Saul will kill him. This is a place of pretty profound brokenness and pretty profound difficulty. I think that it's the kind of situation that few of us have ever been in. And when you're in one of those situations, when life is that desperate, when things are that hard, it's really hard to turn toward the Lord in those moments. It's really hard to see good things. It's hard enough, even if you feel kind of lonely or depressed in a moment, to turn toward the Lord then. It's much easier to waste time or to get distracted and do other things. But David is the author of this series of Psalms that the text brings out or brings into it, 56 and 34 and 52. And so it talks about, like, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God whose word I praise, in God I trust without fear. And again, you have this profound moment of desperation when David is on the run from Saul, when he's just about beside himself with worry, and he doesn't have a place to lay his head, and he doesn't have a home to go to. And this is a place that he prays, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. That's a pretty heroic act of faith. That's a pretty heroic act of placing trust in the Lord. This isn't a kind of cheap faith. This isn't a kind... He's not just saying this and it's not just words. Like, this is a lived experience, and it's visceral, and it's tough, and it's intense. And I think this is part of where the Psalms really provide a foundation for us, and they help shape our hearts in the right direction. Like, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Talks about mercy and faithfulness, the mercy and faithfulness of God, and trust without fear. That David will perform his vows. He will keep his promises. We have in this story the contrast between Saul, who keeps promising to protect the life of David. He swears before the Lord that he won't kill him, and he breaks his promise one after another. He breaks the bonds of friendship and family. He attacks his own son to kill him because his own son supported David. He attacks the people with him. You know, anyone that supports David is sort of persona non grata. And then you have David who promises to keep his vows, to live with his word, to be a man of his word. And that's something really amazing. To me, it speaks to the heart of David. Like, this is part of the reason why he was chosen as king, is he's living in this place of radical faith. He's living in this place of a kind of surrender to the Lord that has been tested and tried and stretched and pushed to its limit. These are also not the words of a madman. These are not the words of someone who actually is crazy. Someone who is deeply convicted of his need for God and deeply convicted of God's providence for him. Psalm 34, I will bless the Lord at all times, his praise ever in my mouth. To find peace in the Lord. This is a situation I have pondered a lot. How do you find peace in the Lord in places of difficulty? Because it's not where we turn at first. We take refuge in all kinds of other things. And this has to arise out of a kind of conviction of heart. It has to arise out of a place of surrender. Finding peace in the Lord is not just an emotional refuge or from the actions of other people. I think first and foremost it has to be a choice. It's a choice to surrender. It's a choice to say, Lord, I choose you. I trust you. And very often what happens is we have this contrast between our desire and we have this contrast between what is interior in our hearts, that we want to trust in the Lord, we want to place it and surrender to Him, and the feeling of worry or anxiety or being overwhelmed or feeling scared or terrified. And we have those feelings and sort of let it change it to say, well, maybe I haven't surrendered yet. Maybe I just need to do it again. Or maybe it didn't work. Maybe there's something wrong with me. But I think surrendering to the Lord is a state of mind. It's a state of heart. And it's not as much an emotional experience. It's more like a muscle. It's more like something that you have to get good at, that you have to think of it a bit like weightlifting. And surrendering to the Lord, finding peace in Him, comes from this attitude of trust, but it's consistent. It's 10,000 times a day. It's every little step that you can take of choosing to take refuge in Him, of choosing to find peace in Him. And it takes a ton of practice. It's not a habit that is built easily. It's not a habit that's built overnight. It's something that you have to work at for years and for decades, usually. Some people seem to have received a grace or a gift from God that helps them surrender more fully. But even then, my experience points to this is something you really have to fight for. It doesn't just happen, and it doesn't work easily. And so I think these Psalms are given to us, and they can be really powerful because, again, they speak to this kind of attitude. And when we read the words of Scripture, sometimes I find myself saying, like, Lord, let this be planted in my heart. Let this be the reality of trusting in you, of finding my peace in you. Let my heart find you as the anchor, the refuge in the storm. And I think it's okay to be honest and admit that it doesn't always feel like it's working, and we don't always kind of come to that place of taking a deep breath and feeling the grace of the Lord and feeling supported in that moment. But nonetheless, that kind of dialogue, that kind of surrender in a very real way, I think is the beginning of this. And it is something that we have to work at and that we face in 1,000 different directions, with everything from our economy in the modern world to our nation today. Some of you have maybe followed the story a little bit now in Haiti. It's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and they've had issues for years. But gangs recently kind of took over the capital, and the government, some people in the government had to kind of leave. I think their president is now in Kenya or somewhere trying to find someone who will help send an army to take back the streets from the gang violence. And it's cycles of violence, and there's real possibilities. I mean, finding refuge in the Lord, I think of the people of the Ukraine. We think of our own problems and our own issues, and we do have them, and they can be very real. But I just wonder how actual bombs falling on top of you changes the calculation, changes your feeling about it. And when trust in the Lord is not just something like, oh, I should do this, this would be a good thing to do, this might help me out in my life. But when trust in the Lord is more so like when there aren't any other options, when there isn't any other solution. In those kind of places, I think that this is also something where you see our intellect and the human person really struggle. When problems become this grave, when problems become this significant, it's easy for it to spiral very quickly out of control, and for things to lead toward despair and ultimately toward death. And I think this is something we also see in the modern world with the problem of depression and suicide and the number of people that kill themselves. It's not easy to find peace in the Lord. It's not easy to live with that kind of stress. So the fact that sometimes we get into these places where mentally things are too much for us and we need a break, I think that's human. I think that's normal. There's all kinds of days where you just reach the end of your rope, and that's going to happen. And I think real Christianity comes in, real faith comes in. You kind of learn where you're at in this journey with Jesus as to whether you turn toward Him in those moments. I can think of a number of times for me that were very much like that. In particular, at one of my trips down to Mayo Clinic, and there was one day when I was sitting, I think I was waiting for an echocardiogram on one of the levels, and they have these lounges and different things. And I just got to the point where I kind of had it with, you wait for your name to be called, they ask you your birth date, you kind of roll your eyes and want to stamp it on your forehead or something. And And those kind of places aren't absent of worry, and they aren't absent of anxiety, and you're just like, enough, like I don't want to do this anymore. And what you do in those moments can be really telling. And I think it's okay. It's okay to admit this is too much for me. I think at one of them I just pulled out a book and started reading and was like, yep, need to do something else for a while. And that can be healthy. There's ways of dealing with this kind of mental stress, relying on other people and friends. Those are the times, for instance, where it feels most lonely, where you feel most alone and afraid. Well, the solution to loneliness is communion, not hiding inside yourself. And it's like our brains get broken, and when we feel most lonely, it's like, well, I don't want to talk to anyone, no one's going to understand, they're going to think worse of me, and all of these thoughts go through our heads, when really the solution, or at least part of the solution, is communion, is support, is friendship. And that's something that I think we have to fight against, or that we have to work toward, is seeking communion. Psalm 52 kind of continues this theme. It talks about being wise like an olive tree. In the Old Testament, there's two images of Israel that are used most frequently. That Israel is like an olive tree. Does anyone know the other one? That Israel is a vine, like a vine that God had planted, a vine that grows grapes, that produces fruit, that is fit for making wine. That shows up, if you remember, in some of the parables of Jesus in the vineyard and the vine dresser, that he's looking for fruit when he goes to the temple and he confronts the Pharisees. He's looking for the fruit of the covenant. And Israel as a vine, vines aren't as strong as trees. They're not as sturdy. They don't have the same kind of stability. They need a trellis. They need things to grow on. They need to be watered by rain and those kind of things. But Jesus uses this image quite frequently. I am the vine and you are the branches. So vines, grapes, and olives are two of the major food products of the region, and they're two of the major images of Israel. Olives were used for a number of different things. They would use the wood to carve things, so olive wood is used. They use the fruit to eat. They also use it to make olive oil. Olive oil was used in medicine. It has some medicinal properties. Was also used in eating and cooking, and was also used in the lamps that they left burning before the Lord. So oil is a sign. Oil is used in the temple. There's all these different connections in the history of Israel between olive trees and the people and their life. And so olive tree, that image becomes something of wisdom and wise and true wealth. That olive oil is a rich oil. Olive trees also grow slowly and live a long time. If you go to Israel now and you go to the Garden of Gethsemane, or where it was, there's a few olive trees left that are several thousand years old. There's a few trees in that grove that saw the time of Jesus, that were there when he was there. Lots of other things aren't, but there's a few olive trees that are there. They can live for several thousand years. In chapter 22, this theme kind of continues because David flees into a cave. You have this kind of descent of David. David was with the king and a friend of the king, and then he has to flee to the priests at Nob, and he's starving, and then he flees to Gath, and he has to feign madness. Now he flees into a cave, and it's completely dark. And you can almost feel this kind of descent. In a cave, you get real dark. Not just a little dark, but real dark, where you can't see anything. And it's probably as much of a spiritual image as it is a physical image. Like in some ways, he is experiencing the darkness of the cave, yes. And so an absence of light in the sense of lights that we have or light for our eyes. But in many ways, he's also descending into the dark in his heart, on the inside, in his mind. And it increases tension in the story. He gathers the outcasts of society. This isn't a good group of people. This is the ragtags. It's not quite a safe place to be. If you think of the modern world and you think of like gangs and gang violence, this is probably the kind of people that David gathers around him. The people that would be on the outs in society. He is afraid for his life and that of his family, so he sends his family to the king of Moab. Somehow he's managed to make a friend with a foreign king, and he ends up returning to Judah. Saul, on the other hand, like the story sort of zips back to Saul and gives us a perspective on him. He berates the people around him about following David. And he talks to them as Benjaminites. Now, one possibility here is that Saul has given lots of roles in his government, given lots of roles in the monarchy to fellow tribesmen. And this is kind of a recipe for disaster. If you give out the good positions to all of your friends, it makes other people jealous. This happens so often in the Native American societies of today on the reservations, that when a chief of the tribe gets elected, they appoint all of their family members to government positions. Not because they're qualified in a lot of cases, but because those are good jobs that actually have a paycheck and that have benefits. And so they're probably not even doing it for the wrong reasons in some case. But it just makes it a mess because every time a new tribal chief is elected, very often they replace all of the heads of the departments and they replace all these people. Well, if you've worked in a business for any length of time, you know that's kind of a recipe for disaster. That's a really difficult way to live. So it seems like Saul has done some of that. He's surrounded by Benjaminites. Benjamin was the smallest tribe at this point because of that murder of, was it Dinah? I think it was Dinah. Back in the time of the Judges, where that person was like cut up into a bunch of pieces, and there was that kind of creepy story. So it seems like he has appointed from a very small group of people that his inner circle is mostly tribesmen. That's not a good way to rule. And in a sense, it's like this whole story has been building and there's storm clouds on the horizon and the storm is coming and it will break soon. So Doeg shows up, that herdsman